Hello everybody, and welcome to another Future of the Fortress. This is a monthly Q&A that Tarn Adams does on the Bay 12 forums, talking about all things Dwarf Fortress. It's usually comprised of a combination of a few things: community Q&A, and feature discussion, and upcoming changes. If you'd like to take part in these discussions, I'll link to the actual forum thread in the description of this video. But another thing that we always start these videos off with is the report for the previous month, where Tarn writes a little bit about what's been going on recently, as well as the number of copies sold. So, let's dive in. April 1st, 2025, March was mostly taken up by GDC and recovery, but we continued routine patches. We'll be able to start up on sieges soon, while the routine patches keep going. I'll probably start with the siege planning just to see how much of a lift that's going to be. We sold 22,000 copies in March, there were 2 separate sales, and 2 separate documentaries. Everything lined up pretty well. The first question comes in from Urist McSaddist, and they say, are we going to see Fort Mode religion get expanded in the relatively near future? I mean, stuff like conversion, and conflict between opposing faiths, and religious persecution. Also, could we see internal political factions be added? It would be cool to see dwarves worshipping an elven deity, and vote to limit tree cutting, or to legalize cannibalism. And Tarn's response is, I don't know how far afield we'll get initially here. There are some interesting questions about whether the gods you select have different effects on your defenses, etc. And suddenly that makes things a lot more practical, and makes those problems more immediate if they go in. But it is still tangential to the siege update itself. Fortress subgroups generally are something we've referred to from time to time, but I'm not sure when we'll focus on it. When laws can change, they'll probably be necessary at least. And a bulky one from Ilanto, and they say, I'm very interested in this mode switching feature. Do you think that in the more distant future it might be possible to implement multiple mode switches within the same game? Also, do you think it could be possible to have the world progress constantly in both modes? I'm referring to cities continuing to develop, workshops continuing to operate, etc., while in adventure mode. Considering that time passes differently in each mode, regarding mode switching, I was thinking along these lines. For example, if you're an adventurer, you could only access Fortress mode if you created that site, or if you managed to become the mayor of the location. At that point, a tag would be added to your game, anchoring you to that site, and then from that site you could switch to adventure mode with any of the inhabitants, and any of them could return to Fortress mode only at that site. You could only access Fortress mode in another location if that character with whom you started adventure mode creates another site, or manages to become the mayor of another location. At that point, the old tag would be replaced with the new site, and you would no longer be able to control your old character, unless you regain control of the old site. Would something like this be possible in the distant future, considering that the difficulty of the time differences would have to be overcome first? Another thing I'd like to ask about is fishing. Is there any intention to make it more realistic? I mean, it's done using a fishing rod, without the characters having to go into the water and catch the fish with their hands. And Tarn's response is, for mode switching, the differences make it hard to support switching rapidly between modes, but we would like to have various ways to initiate switches. Fishing changes aren't on the near horizon, but it would be cool if it were neater. And the first of many questions from DPH Kraken, and responses in fact, and they say, a civilization starts with a pantheon of gods, and then a prophet can found a religion based on one of these gods. What do you envision the religion entity as? Is it simply a cult practice for a specific god? Do you imagine the ones in-game as representing a broader social order, akin to Christianity or Islam, etc.? And Tarn's response is, there isn't any nesting or other connection, so it's not a very clear concept. The religion entity right now is just supposed to capture more specific practices than simple belief in a deity. And another question from Kraken, and they say, without a religion entity, will there still be the need for ritualist roles, like a folk healer or exorcist? And Tarn's response is, if it gets to that point, it might imply a religion entity as it currently is used, but the situation is about to change and then it won't be clear, since it's not clear yet what religious powers will be tied to deities or specific practices. And the last of this little batch of questions from Kraken, and they say, at times it feels like the game covers up a more culturally complex world, with this layer of high fantasy paint. Here's a dwarf Hillix, and they speak the dwarf language, when the reality is a lot more complex. Do you have anything in mind to help the generated nations and cultures become more distinct and visible in this current world of graphics and Lua? And Tarn's response is, I can only do so much with the time I've spent. Reality will always be more complex. Lots of the upcoming ideas slowly add complexity, so I'm not sure how to answer this. In the near term, probably not. It was a lot of work just to get the clothing to appear graphically, and distinguishing the civilizations further that way will require a lot more graphical work. The same is true of languages. It's a lot of work, and the current Dwarven language isn't complicated enough by itself. And a question from Killer Clowns, and they need to tell me if they see this video whether or not they're from outer space, and they say, are there plans to move away from good and evil lands to creation myth magical lands during the current arc? How far away is it, if even on the table yet at all? And Tarn's response is, it's still on the table, but there are no more arcs. We're just starting the Siege release, but it isn't a vast arc of things. Some magic will be involved though, and we're hoping to get started on related matters. A question comes in from Nihilus, and they say, one of the things I like to do in Fortress mode is build impressive cathedrals dedicated to whatever happens to be my favorite god in that world. However, to my knowledge, there is no way to convert dwarves or attract dwarves of a specific cult. We know that dwarves are generally a stubborn race, but one would think that over time, factors like glorious churches and skillful priests and peer pressure or reading books written by devout followers could influence more malleable dwarves to convert. On the other hand, a traumatic event might cause someone to change their perspective entirely and choose a completely new path. And perhaps, particularly, surely dwarves or rebellious teenagers would gravitate towards a god that opposes the dominant faith around them. At the very least, having a beautiful cathedral dedicated to a specific god should attract more dwarves who already worship that deity, having heard of it somewhere. Is there a plan to make religion and conversions a mechanic we can actively engage with? And Tarn's response is, the embark scenarios we've discussed from time to time were meant in part to bring these ideas more clearly into the game, since the fortress would have more associated ideas. But they shouldn't be linked to the founding every time, of course, and that will still probably be when we dig into it, though. Now, this one is listed like a multi-parter, but Tarn answers it as one question, so I'm just going to read it as is. And this comes in from Onura46, and they say, I recently read an interesting book called Special Operations in the Age of Cavalry, 1100 to 1500. And the coincidental siege improvement announcement, which has me so excited, spurred me to ask if we might see anything like this in the future, assuming it hasn't been ruled out as just plain unfun. Invaders using a corrupted citizen to open and unlock doors or pull levers for them. Enemy agents and invaders attempting to free caged prisoners. Enemy agents attempting to poison important citizens. Could this be more possible with magic changes? Invaders destroying infrastructure just because they can. I've seen trolls destroy my farm plots, for example, and it's always felt like an effective attrition against me. Invaders setting fire to buildings. And diplomats seeking or offering ransom for people, or prisoner exchanges. And Tarn's response is, all of these have come up in the discussions, but I doubt we'll get to them all this time through. We do watch out for things not being fun. If corrupt citizens don't just steal artifacts, but flat out kill your fortress, there needs to be related mechanics for catching them in advance, or otherwise mitigating the loss. I mean, clearly the way to mitigate that loss is necromancy, right? Right? Next question comes in from Chang, and they say, with the new dev process of going for smaller but faster content updates instead of large arcs, should we expect to get updates that require a new world to be generated more often? On that note, would it ever be possible to have an option to save the shape of a world, the landmass and biomes, etc., separately from the history, and then be able to regenerate only a history on that specific map? I really like my current world. It has nice beefy mountains. And Tarn's response is, no, I don't think saves will be broken any more often. That's usually related to some specific change that doesn't depend on the update size. And we had a map painter and import thing before, and it's possible those still exist in some form. I don't recall if any of that loads currently, and I don't have plans for an exporter specifically. But it's possibly already a utility someplace, I'm not sure. Yours McAllister had a very long question, so I actually shortened it down a bit because I wanted to try and keep this video under 30 minutes. Let's dive in. They want to talk about ASCII mode and immersion storytelling in version 50. This may just be a me issue. I play version 50 on GeForce Now, as I have Mac OS. And while I do play version 50 with sprites after the hotkey additions, I boot my old version 47 install whenever I want to play ASCII. The scaling of the UI in ASCII when zooming and zooming in and out and moving up and down Z levels is even more difficult now with how the UI is arranged. And now partly graphical with icons, many of the elements seem to scale over one another, or off-screen entirely. Any chance ASCII can have a non-scaling UI when zooming, at least as an option? The mix of faux ASCII borders on the menu tabs and essentially sprite icons for some of the UI elements and overlays are busy and distracting, and introduce an aesthetic that wasn't present in version 47. Any chance that these UI elements might be given another pass for readability and aesthetic consistency? I loved the prior clean simplicity. And Tarn's response is, it's all one grid in ASCII mode, until we can do play textures that aren't 32 by 32, that's an engine limitation. The old interface didn't support the mouse, which makes it harder to keep the old look. Generally, it's not possible for me to support two interfaces. Some things do look bad, though. Question comes in from Vanzetti, and they kind of have a double-parter, but the second one is real short, so I'm just going to read them both. And they say, in the future, when it is possible to create worlds with more random generation, will it extend to categories like animals, plants, and stone and metals? And how will graphics work in this case? And will trees get bigger? And Tarn quotes DPH Kraken, so I will read their response. And they say, the future is now. All of those categories are now data-driven and open to Lua-based procedural generation in the beta branch. Graphics are an ongoing question right now, and generated creatures use a set of fixed RCP layer tokens that cover most of these cases. Theropods don't use their unique sprites, and birds don't have any, etc. But they've got a number of limitations, and this should correspond with modding and extensibility improvements for predefined layer graphics, like being able to show divine equipment on a creature. Materials are in the best spot here since their graphics are just based on their state color. And Tarn's response is, DPH Kraken handled part 1 pretty much. We're working on it. And about trees, I think they are fine generally, but there could be larger trees as we get to those sorts of myth and things. But we're not planning a general enlargement, if that's what you meant. A question comes in from Ivan Zephyr, and they say, in the upcoming Myth and Magic arc, I'm interested to hear about plans for industries that may pop up. A bit of a logistics nerd with Dwarf Fortress, things such as herbalist workshops and alchemy, enchantment workshops, potion workshops, and tinctures. And if they have any connections to natural resources in an embark, so that we might be as much interested in embarking on willow and coca and poppy and aloe and ginger as we are on lignite, marble, hematite, and so forth. In terms of potions, it would be fun to imbue weapons and arrows and such with certain properties, which might affect certain materials or elemental resistances. For example, an arrow imbued with fire might do very well or very badly with elemental resistances, or modifiers be a thing depending on the properties of different materials. And Tard's response is, yeah, as we go. That's the plan, to get whatever is generated to have a standard feeling place in the fortress in terms of buildings, skills, jobs, laborers, items, etc. Just like the real world stuff. A question comes in from P. Elijah, and they say, I was wondering about the noble role champion in fortress mode. It appears he is a moral officer of sorts, just walking around being a pillar of society and imparting the other dwarves with special thoughts when talking to him. I was wondering if you could describe his role and what it currently does, and if it has any other plans for the future. And Tarn's response is, there's literally nothing else to it. It's a very old position. Personally, I would really like to see it participate in duels to settle parlays or something. I don't know. Could be cool. A question comes in from Stained Class, and they say, once World Gen is over, the worlds tend to stagnate in terms of history and events. Most of these almost come exclusively from the player's actions. I know time passing a lot slower during gameplay than during World Gen is a factor, but even without that, it feels like a lot less happens once the player plays. Is it something that may be addressed in the future? with a lot more events happening outside of your fortress and adventurers group. Perhaps the possibility to resume world gen history once you retire a fortress or adventurers to see their consequences in the world. This one is not exclusively addressed to Toady, but what is the Watsonian explanation to the fact that despite cave dragons being supposed to be dragons who have adapted to cave life, still have their vestigial wings, while normal dragons don't, while the latter have no evolutionary interest to lose their wings? And Tarn's response is, this is one of the huge projects of the game. We've taken steps over the last decade or more to make it happen, but things come in over time. And it's much easier to add features to world generation because it's abstract there. And we do it because it makes for more interesting histories. But making them happen in play is harder. I'm not sure evolution entered into the dragon question. I don't remember who has wings in the raws, if anybody. I could check, but I think I'll just sit on it for now. And a question from DPH Kraken, and they say, double dipping this time, but I was data mining the Lewis stuff and found tables for unimplemented night creatures. I recognize most of them from DF Talk 14, but two caught my eye, Sorcerer and Royal. Could you tell us a little bit about the roles that they would play, and if demon-trained sorcerers have anything to do with them? And Tarn's response is, it has nothing to do with the new stuff. I'm not sure Sorcerer is different from Necromancer and Royal is different from Mummies. There are other classes like Animated Furniture and Natural Undead and Marine ones that don't have their colors used at all, though it's unclear if any of this still stands. And a question from Crystallized Mire, and they say, is there any reason why animal people in experiments can't select a belief? Why is it that only human civilizations have chosen ones? And Tarn quotes Spatula, so I will read their response. And they say, the requirements to start as a chosen are that you start in a market site, and that there is a valid temple and a priest there. Dwarven civs are not included because fortresses are not a valid starting sites for non-ordinary adventurers. Elven civs aren't included because they lack temples. And then, following up that response, Spatula has a question for Tarn. And they say, are you ever going to change the descriptions for the 5 main civilized species? I feel like most of them are not accurate to the species themselves, telling you more about the culture typically associated with that species, which is strange if you are, for example, an elf that is a member of a dwarven civ and finds nature repulsive, or other creature descriptions are typically more about describing the physical appearance and traits of the creature. And Tarn's response is, almost all of the descriptions in the game are short and bad, or non-existent, when it comes to creatures, and most items, and most everything except for the really verbose ones. It hasn't really been a huge priority to improve them for whatever reason. And a question from Vanzetti, and they say, will there be more options to do with prisoners, such as convincing them to switch side and join you, or ransoming them back to their side, or enslaving them? The last option might sound cruel, but is typically in line with what prisoners are usually used for: gladiatorial combat and volcano sacrifices. Somebody really needs to read the ethics portion of the wiki. I will link that in the description of this video if you are curious as to what I'm talking about. And Tarn quotes Fantastic Dwarf, so I will read their response. Technically, you can interrogate your prisoners, but the entire concept of a prison and an animal stockpile is extremely loose. The only definite way to actually create sentient invader prisoners without a sheriff and captain of the guard dealing with citizens is to install the metal cages with the sentience inside of them to a dungeon directly, and it'll change their status, preventing the cages from being decommissioned and expanded the cage limit, in which can be useful if you catch a hostile thief, but less useful if they are holding the artifact you want to prize from them. I regularly like to put all the child snatchers I catch and bulk cages of goblins, 7 per cage, in my dungeon as well. The occasional Cyclops in its own little copper cage supermax cell, nicely, as an alternative to killing them, if they will reanimate in undead or attack just the environment. The rest comes down to ethics. Dwarves don't abide by slavery, so it's probably a very low priority. And also a point of contention if slavery was introduced to the game to simply sell to humans who engage in that activity. There's more for a bigger debate on if your fort does activity the Dwarven nation doesn't. Is it an internal corruption or villain issue, or is the player manipulating lawful dwarves issue? And Tarn's response is, Fantastic Dwarf covered some of it. We would like to do more with them than just having them sit in cages. We brought up some notes for the Siege update again, since prisoners are related there, but it's not the highest priority versus some of the other Siege features. A question comes in from Plump Helmet Man, and they say, are the Siege improvements likely to give elves any new magic to use against your fort? While demon-trained sorcerers and the like sound really neat, I'm looking forward to them. It seems to me like elves are practically in dire need of an upgrade. They currently rely almost entirely on sheer amounts of giant animal cavalry to avoid being curb-stomped by your militia, which can be a bit unsatisfying after the first few times you face them. And Tarn's response is, for elves, I'm not sure if we're going to focus more on tactics or magic. We had animated trees before, but that's quite a bit harder now, the way trees are. Other things are possible, of course. They won't be left alone anyway. And the final question of this Future of the Fortress comes in from Zisudra, and they say, in your ponderings on range, what are your thoughts on how that might work with the creature sizes? Like, could a bronze colossus punch something further away than the next tile? And Tarn's response is, I don't know that reach is going to go as far as skipping tiles, since that probably has some very annoying edge, or not so edge, cases, when multiple creatures are involved, etc. It's also a UI annoyance, when there's lots of creatures around, but for formations later, tile skipping also seems very useful. It'll probably be okay if it remains a relationship between adjacent creatures, but that will start to chafe. And we've made it to the end for this month's Future of the Fort. Thank you very much for watching. There's something I would like to make you aware of if you aren't already. Tarn recently updated the Dwarf Fortress development page on bay12games.com/dwarves. The full URL requires another slash and then dev.html. This page includes all of the things that they're aiming to add to the game in the near and distant future. So whenever you're asking about a particular feature possibly being added, if you want to see what's actively being considered and or worked on or partially implemented, or if you're confused about a feature that seems buggy or half done and you want to know why, this page might be a good place to start, as it is kind of the long-term roadmap and list of things that have already been completed. Just because it's been updated now, I just wanted to point that out. I'll also link to that in the description of this video. Thank you very much for watching. Seriously, it really does mean a lot. A lot of people have been watching my videos through the recommendeds recently because of the recent documentary by NoClip, as well as the video from Down the Rabbit Hole, and frankly, it's been kind of lovely to see. The influx of new players has been fun as always, and I'm glad that the tutorials are still relevant in some way, considering I made most of them roughly 2 years ago in a manic haze and don't even remember recording half of them. Regardless, I'm working on my next big project soon. It might have something to do with vampires. We'll see. Keep an eye out. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you sooner than you might expect.